Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I know everyone's going to be feeling just filled with inspiration, thought-provoking topics, so much amazing content from the last couple of days. And I'm delighted to be chairing this panel as part of the last day of NPC Ignites. Welcome to this session where we're looking at the future of philanthropy. So just a small topic, I'm sure we'll get through that quickly. We are, of course, on social media during this conference. So do join the discussion there using the hashtag NPC Ignites. We're going to have time for questions later on in the session, but please feel free to post them either in chat or in the Q&A function, and I'll try to get as many of those in later on as possible. This session is being recorded, and there are journalists present, not least on the panel with Charles, who's joining us. But otherwise, I hope we can have a really frank and open debate about philanthropy for the future, optimism, pessimism, strengths and weaknesses. I wanted to just set the scene a little bit for this topic. Philanthropy is a continuously evolving sphere, and I think the last 2 years have seen so much debate, but crucially action in this space. A lot of critique of philanthropy before we even began this pandemic. The critique rightly being heightened in some ways during the last 2 years, but also a defense around the role and contribution of philanthropy, and hopefully some positive signs of philanthropists and foundations stepping up, changing their behavior for the better, collaborating, coordinating more, moving with more speed and with more trust in grantees. And I really hope that those are trends that continue long after the pandemic. But we are at the tip of the iceberg in terms of changes that lie ahead for funders and those they support. We've got major issues on the horizon: long-tailed COVID recovery, transition to net zero by 2030. And I was struck in the last discussion about the next generation having utterly absorbed the questions and the urgency around climate change and the impact which will have on so many of the causes that we work in. We're seeing change in the composition of philanthropists, long overdue, with more young, diverse philanthropists from different backgrounds, and a lot of innovation around financing models, how we get money to grantees, how we support them and grow movements. We're going to be talking about the vision for 2030 and beyond, which used to seem a long way in the future and suddenly seems not that far away. For me, the heart of it is, are we optimistic or pessimistic about the future of philanthropy? What would we like that future vision to be? And what do we fear that it might be? And what actions do we want to see happening to make it the future of philanthropy that we need and that our charities deserve? What can we do to make that happen? For me personally, that's a passion about data, digital, about modernizing philanthropy and bringing it out of the 19th century, at least getting to the 20th would be a good start. It's about tackling lack of diversity, hashtag charity so white, Black Lives Matters. These have all come to the fore in debate over the last couple of years, but these are not new problems. They're finally having attention put on them. And how can we make the way that we support charities fit for purpose? So I'm thrilled that we've got a really impressive panel who are going to add their thoughts and theories to us today. I'm going to come first to Sonal Patel. Sonal is the CEO of God, My Silent Partner, a family foundation established by her parents, which supports frontline organizations working to improve the lives of some of the most vulnerable people in India and the UK. And she is very much like-minded with me, passionate about the role of philanthropy, but also honest about its weaknesses and where we need to do better. Sonal, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you can talk for a few minutes about some of the things that you would like to see change, some of the things you're hopeful for, and particularly the voices that we need to hear from. Sonal, over to you.
Thanks, Fran. Well, so, yeah, I mean, I have to start with that confession, which is that I changed the assignment because my vision of philanthropy in 2030 is not just my own, and it's a shared vision with the frontline leaders of the organisations that we serve at GMSP. So I asked this question to all of them, and to see what would they want in philanthropy from the next decade. And what was interesting is that overwhelmingly the responses were quite common, and they focused on their relationships with donors and philanthropists. In the next 10 years, they said that they hoped for donors who want to get closer to the work. They want funders who are impassioned, working in areas that they really believe in, and deepening their knowledge of the problem and its potential solutions. They also hoped for donors who genuinely trust them. I know we've talked a lot about trust, but what are all the good things that come from that? Well, that's longer term relationships, it's funding of core costs, and it allows those organisations to do all those buzzwords that we like to talk about, but we don't fund them to actually do, which is strategize, pivot, to take risks, to fail. We don't like to talk about that, and to learn. And they hoped for recognition that, like any senior corporate leader, non-profit leaders need to attract and retain great talent. And in order to do that, donors need to look after their teams better. In the last 2 years, we talk about their mental well-being, we talk about looking after them physically, but we also have to look after them financially. And they told us that they hope that donors would reconnect with the original intention of philanthropy and its purity of purpose, and that there's a danger that we're turning this industry, in want of a better word, into a business that's so obsessed with impact metrics that we incentivize the wrong things. And we're at risk of abandoning some of the most marginalized communities that are facing the most complex and challenging problems just because we don't know how to measure the impact or the progress that they're making. And I was really struck by the connections between these responses, because the organisations I asked were really different. Some were large organisations, some were small grassroots organisations. But it made me think that imagine if we shaped our philanthropic practice to meet our charities partners' hope for us. And what would we be able to achieve together? And what kind of world would we build together? And it made me think about values, because values are so central to our family and our family foundation. Values like love and trust and humility. And these are values that are familiar to all of us. And what was interesting before we joined the call is we all connected on, one's got off to parents' evening, one's got a year 2 child that doesn't listen to them, and one's got a year 6 and 7 child that doesn't listen to me. And so we can really come together on values. And even in the last 18 months, the pandemic, the effects of the climate crisis, and even the recent Facebook outage, they really made us realise how connected we are to one another. And it made me think about, how does that connection show up for us in our giving? And for us at GMSP, we believe in this shared sense of humanity, which we demonstrate through trust-based philanthropy. And it took me a long time to try and coin a phrase of how do we describe this. But we talk about it as spiritual solidarity with our partners. And what that looks like in practice is actively doing the work to redress historical power imbalances. Fran, you talked about Charity Say White and Black Lives Matter. These aren't new things. So what are we doing to change the systems that we're so used to and many of us are really comfortable in? And it means unrestricted funding. We talk about this a lot. I still see a lot of the charities we work with say we still don't get unrestricted funding. We don't have long-term relationships. At best, we have a funder funding us for 3 years. And now we're looking in our family at funding for up to 10 years, because problems aren't even solved within 10 years. And it also means supporting leaders and their teams and their resilience and their well-being. So by 2030, I hope that more philanthropists are doing all of this and more, and that we see more humility, more trust, and more love. And I believe that the next generation of philanthropists will come to this work with more of themselves, just more. I think they're so much more comfortable with who they are and saying what they think, and they don't have this separate philanthropist hat and separate going out hat and mother hat, etc. I think they're just much more authentic. And we know that many people are set to inherit a lot of wealth in the coming years, and that the greatest wealth transfer in history is actually taking place now, with the baby boomer generation starting to pass on their wealth to their children and their grandchildren. And so I was thinking about how will these second and third generation philanthropists change the giving landscape when you ask this question. And speaking as a second generation philanthropist, such a mouthful myself, I think it will bring a major shift in how we give. And I think the next gen philanthropists are asking really hard questions of themselves as well as their philanthropy. And they want to integrate their giving into who they are and what they stand for. So in the same way that we want to recognize and respect the humanity of our partners, I think it's about recognizing our own humanity as well. And that's such an amazing opportunity for us to all grow closer, not only to ourselves, but also to each other. So coming back to the original question of what will philanthropy look like in 2030, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that when we're thinking about what it should look like, we need to build that vision alongside the charities that we work with and who we work for. Thanks, Fran.
Thanks so much, Sonal. That's a fantastic way to start us off. Anna, I'd like to come to you next. Just as an introduction, Anna is the head of social sustainability for BritishLand and has been responsible for designing and leading that strategy, which was launched in April 2020, and for adopting a place-based approach to social contribution. Anna, from your perspective in BritishLand, how comfortable do you feel with terms like trust-based philanthropy, about relationships with grantees, and how much would you situate yourself in actually more of the business case for organisations and how we can get organisations and corporations to focus on change?
Thank you, Fran. No small topic there. I think, well, from within BritishLand, but also speaking from a corporate and a business perspective, I think of this area as being significantly more than philanthropy or trust-based philanthropy. Or maybe it's more of an evolved meaning of the term for business, as businesses have already begun to shift away from that. And it's shifted from one of, I would say, is financial performance, sort of sprinkled, if you like, with philanthropy, to one where we are seeing companies now integrating social value and social purpose into their business models. Now, I know we're looking forward here, so if I could just go back over the past 10 years, because I think if you look at some of the changes that have gone on, it can really help you think about what that vision is. It's 2030, and the external environment and the role of business within that has significantly shifted within those 10 years. And I would say it's actually more so than any other period. So if you go back 10 years, we were in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, when public mistrust in authority and big business had really taken root. But there was also very much a broad desire for business specifically to do more. And then you go to something like 2012, it was the year that Larry Fink, he's the CEO of BlackRock, and he began publishing an annual public letter to the CEOs of his firm's portfolio companies. And he was calling for action on social and environmental issues. And he was holding these companies to account on that. So this is a big investor talking in this way and publicly talking in this way, which made a very big impact, certainly in my world, in the corporate world. And then if you go to the last 5 years, which we'll all agree, I'm sure, it's been a period of really rapid political and social change, where the emerging political view of capitalism is one that it is not distributing growth widely enough. And all of this ties in with the growth of social media, which has really changed the way people are interacting with business and big business and brands, and of course Generation Z sort of coming into this too. And you can see the evidence of that. You can see it in recent legislation that's come through, in day-to-day news. So there's been a push, I would say, a distinctive push now for businesses to define how their activities are contributing to broader society. And sort of my favourite example when I sort of think about this always is a company like Unilever, whereby, you know, they're obviously really focused on their consumers, but they hit the headlines 2 years ago because they came out and they stated that they were prepared to sell brands which could not evidence their sort of positive contribution to society. So in essence, there is a future for us whereby even something like Marmite, whether you love it or hate it, has to have a social purpose to survive. So all of that, that's the sort of backdrop that I always sort of think of. And that's without even getting into the challenges we've had with the pandemic and the last 18 months. But I think that's sort of like looking back on that and looking to where we are now, where businesses generally speaking are now, that businesses have started to respond, and some have moved faster than others, but the movement in this space is significant. And I would say, I think about it as businesses now require a license to operate. So businesses have to evidence and articulate their social impact, their contribution, and they have to do it corporately because of their reputation. They also have to be able to evidence it to their customers and their customers' customers and their people and other key stakeholders. You know, you're getting investor questions around this now as well, because it's becoming a key influencer in who people want to work for, where they visit, their places of work, what they eat, what brand they want to wear, to invest in all of that. It's really moved from being a good thing to do, an important thing to do, to now being, I would say, an essential and an integrated part of how business operates. So the next 10 years, and Fran, going back to one of your questions in terms of are we optimistic or are we pessimistic, I am very, very optimistic about this. I really do fully expect there to be a lot of impact in this area. I expect there to be a lot of collaboration, I would say, between the private sector, the public sector and the third sector, more so than at any other time. And I expect that the businesses that really are thriving are the ones that have ensured that social purpose is core to and an integrated part of how they operate and the decisions they make. So at BritishLand, you know, we have a place-based approach, you mentioned it, to social contribution, but we think of it and we talk about it as being a future where across our business, and I mean really across our business, we are undertaking what we call socially intelligent business decisions. So it's one where we can deliver both profits and improve the economic and the social conditions in the areas in which we are operating. And, you know, in terms of what this space looks like, you know, I think it's, you know, going back to the point Sonal was making, I share some of those sort of concerns over the challenges there are. I'm always sort of marked up against the environmental side of sustainability, which is so much easier to measure. So the social side is inherently challenging to measure, but I do think there will be more, and there's a need for some sort of national or global sort of indices that you can really, like quality assurance marks that companies have to achieve or have to evidence. I think there needs to be more global consensus on that. But I think it's an exciting time, a really exciting time, and a busy time too. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anna. That's fantastic. Really lots of food for thought. We're going to speed through because I want to hear from everybody and get to questions as well. So next, I'd like to come to Sir Harvey McGrath. I'm delighted Harvey can join us as he's a fellow NPC trustee, but also a huge source of wisdom and knowledge in this sector. Sir Harvey is the chair of Big Society Capital, has a long and distinguished career in the international financial services industry, and is a founding trustee of NPC, and a trustee of a number of charities. Harvey, I'd like to ask you about where impact investing fits into philanthropy. Is the future of philanthropy actually all based on impact and the different financial models we can use to achieve that impact? And what would we challenge impact investing about, whether it's picking off easy targets or it's actually the main way that we can use impact as a source of value? So Harvey, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fran, and good afternoon, everybody. You know, I think what Anna has said provides a very interesting backdrop for my thoughts, because philanthropy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the broader context of the changes that are taking place in business and society. And Anna is absolutely right, I think, to describe some fundamental changes that are taking place in the way in which the world of business is operating. I think the paradigm of the 1970s, if I could call it that, which was to focus on profit maximization within the law, and you know, the negative consequences of that in terms of social or environmental impact were someone else's problem. I think that paradigm has been seriously challenged. It still is out there, but I think it is seriously challenged. So businesses and the capital that finance those businesses, I think, are increasingly moving along the path that Anna touched on, which is to say, they're moving from not giving a damn, if I can characterize that historic paradigm in that way, to acting to avoid or reduce harm, which is to say, to mitigate or reduce negative outcomes for people and for the planet. Beyond that, people are moving to consider benefit for all stakeholders, and that is generating positive outcomes for people and the planet. And then there are businesses, again, as Anna has suggested, that are seeking to contribute to solutions. That is to say, generating positive outcomes for otherwise underserved people and the planet. Now, why do I talk about that in the context of impact investing and philanthropy? And to come back to some of Fran's questions. Well, because in a very real sense, philanthropy and impact investing are both in the same space of seeking to contribute to solutions, to deliver change, positive change for otherwise underserved people and indeed underserved, overlooked environmental impact. And I think that the changes that are taking place have much further to run. I think these are what I'll call secular changes. I don't think they're transient. So they're not a function of the credit crisis a decade ago. I think they are really fundamental changes to the way in which consumers and investors and government look at the role of business. So I think there are a number of important implications that flow from that. The first is, and Anna has talked about this, that I think the relationship of philanthropy and business will be fundamentally different, is changing, but will be fundamentally different going forward. Business will simply not be a source of funding out of the CSR budget or a corporate foundation. I think there's an opportunity for a much richer relationship with the communities that need addressed and need served. And secondly, I think in the space of contributing to solutions, I think this is the common domain of philanthropy and impact investing. And in my view, that overlap should be very much built on and developed. You know, looked at through an investing lens, contributing, thinking about investing, both philanthropy and impact investing are looking at investing for impact. That is essentially what we do when we make a donation or make an investment where we expect a return. Clearly, the difference between the two is that for philanthropy, traditionally, that rate of return is a 100% loss of capital, a donation or a gift or a grant. Whereas for impact investors, there is an expectation of the return of the capital and the return on the capital. In some cases, that return on the capital might be zero. In some cases, it might be a market rate, and in many cases, it is between the two. But I think both investing and philanthropy need to share a similar decision-making process. Looking at investee organizations in terms of their people, in terms of their business model, their governance, and their impact. So my hope looking forward would be that we can build on that overlap, explore ways in which impact investing and philanthropy can work more effectively together, as opposed to, as it's sometimes perceived, in opposition to each other. For example, by coming together in blended capital structures or in higher risk areas where philanthropy can provide the catalytic capital, which can be leveraged by more market priced capital. I think these things will enable us to address one of the real difficulties that I think we face when we look at the scale of the challenges that we have before us. And that is to say that I think without engaging the much larger pools of capital that business and the financial markets can bring to bear on these problems, we will simply not be able to address them within the sphere and size and scope of what we describe currently as the philanthropic pools of capital. I'm not pessimistic, therefore, about this broader definition of investing, embracing philanthropy, because I think the direction of travel from the public sector, from the private sector, and from the social sector is very clear. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity to build on those trends, to push on those open doors, and to build some real scale to help tackle the problems that we know sit out there. Fran.
Thank you so much, Harvey. Some words of wisdom there with great experience behind them. I'd like to come to Charles next. Charles is the editor of Alliance magazine with over a decade of experience in philanthropy, having previously worked as the executive director of the Pears Foundation and more recently at the Oxford Centre for the Study of Philanthropy. Charles, through Alliance, you have a global picture of the problems and opportunities we're looking at in philanthropy around the world, not just from the British or European perspective. What can you tell us about those wider pictures? How much are the questions the same, whether we're asking them in London or New York or Beijing? Are we grappling with the same issues? Are we trying different solutions? And how do you feel about the critique of philanthropy and where we should go next?
Thank you, Fran. It's a real pleasure to be here, and congratulations to New Philanthropy Capital for their pioneering work in the field over a number of decades. It's a privilege to be on the panel with you and Harvey from NPC. As you say, I had the benefit of both directing a family foundation, now editing a publication on philanthropy, which has given me a different view as well as that kind of global perspective. But one thing I think most people would agree is it's very hard to make generalizations about philanthropy, and context really matters, including geographical context. But before I just come on to address some of those points, I just want to respond very briefly to the points that have been made by the other panelists. Just to say to Sonal, I really endorse what you're saying, your humanitarian vision around philanthropy rooted in that spiritual solidarity. I think it's very interesting to see a renaissance of these ideas, and I've got some further comments to make on that. And I was just thinking, listening to Anna's comments just around the development of a kind of focus on responsible business. And my only hope in relation to that is that the rhetoric doesn't exceed the reality. Then there could be a potential for disillusionment if there's a gap between what companies are then claiming to do and what the reality happens. So again, it's very interesting to see that shift. And then on Harvey's points, just would say that I think he's absolutely right around that point around finance and engaging finance for social public good. But I wonder whether impact investing is necessary but not sufficient. Most of the action around finance, including the finance of foundations when they're investing their assets for the returns that generate the grants, is on the global capital markets. How foundations are investing on the global capital markets, not simply that small proportion that's allocated to impact investing. That really raises a wider question, which I'll try and touch on in a moment, just around how foundations are using their endowments or not using them due to their mission. But my comments would be really just threefold. I think to pick up on what Fran says, there's the conversations about philanthropy, not just in the UK, but in many places in the world, as philanthropy surges, are happening against the backdrop of a growth in private wealth, but also of wealth inequality. From our reckoning, there's 25 times more billionaires today than when Alliance first started covering philanthropy 25 years ago. I think that's a problem for philanthropy in that it's reflecting philanthropy's kind of being a conduit or a product of the inequality in systems that create these differentials in wealth in the first place, which make it hard to claim that philanthropy is a vehicle for tackling inequality. Although some would argue that's not its primary role in any case. But I would also argue it's a significant opportunity for the philanthropy. These sums of money could then be reconstituted for the public good. But I want to suggest today just 3 things that could be done that I think could help to realize that ambition. First is more money from philanthropy. The second is better use of philanthropic resources in some of the ways that Sonal's been talking about. And the third is for the wealthiest in our society to recognize that they have the broadest shoulders. They could actually be leading calls to pay more tax, as they're now beginning to do in the US. So I want to bring in that US experience. But taken together, I think those 3 elements, you could see philanthropy and elite philanthropy rebuilding its trust with the rest of society and helping people see the good that philanthropy can do and the potential it has. Just very briefly, just to touch on these 3 areas. On more money from philanthropy, I personally think there's time for a serious debate about whether the wealthiest are giving enough and whether they could be giving more. And with that, I think there's questions that are emerging about whether there should be a mandatory payout from foundations as well as donor advised funds. Not only have the wealthiest in society become richer, but foundations' assets have grown. If you take, for example, I'm looking at the foundation giving trends. Take the Garfield Weston Foundation, second largest foundation in the UK by assets. In 2018-19, it had 10 billion in assets, but spent just 74 million, which is a payout rate of less than 1%. In Australia, in Canada, in the US, foundations are required to spend a percentage of their assets. And in the US at the moment, there's debates about raising that level from 5 to 10%, and for that requirement to be extended to donor advised funds. Some concerns are, well, if foundations are required to give more, but donor advised funds aren't, then donors will just shift that route. But I think that's an argument for being more ambitious, not less. And in America, there's a very libertarian culture, and yet there's a mandatory payout requirement there. So I think there's a question to be asked about what is so different about the UK that means that we shouldn't have the same payouts as in those other wealthy countries that I've mentioned. So I think there's a debate that's overdue. And I think alongside that, I think the narrative that British philanthropy responded well in the COVID pandemic is partly true. I think there's been, an increase in flexible funding, more trusting relationships built, some emergency funding that's been very progressive. But if you look at the wealth that was generated with the surging of the stock market during the COVID pandemic, when many people were suffering the most, I think there's a real question about, and we'll see from the foundation giving trends figures, whether foundations financially stepped up significantly enough. And I think the wider UK charity sector really may be focused on the wrong target through its Never More Needed campaign. They were calling on the government and the taxpayer to give more to support charities. But actually, there could have been and should have been, in my view, a call for foundations to be more scrutiny on foundations about the levels that they were giving through either foundations or donor advised funds. So I think there is a wider question about that growing wealth inequality and the extent to which philanthropy and foundations can do even more than they're already doing. The second area is around better giving. I won't say too much about that because I think Sonal has covered many of the points, but I do think greater transparency from donor advised funds, I think New Philanthropy Capital's Open Philanthropy project, your efforts, Fran, on 360 giving are all positive movements in the right direction, as are attempts to diversify philanthropy and diversify foundation boards. And I know there's an agenda to rate foundations and their diversity, and I think that will hopefully yield some welcome insight into the extent to which philanthropy is reflecting the society that it aims to serve. Core funding and the trust-based philanthropy over a longer period of time, I think, is a very interesting development. Sometimes that development is counterposed or contrasted with the strategic philanthropy that New Philanthropy Capital and others were associated with in the early, in 2000, 2010. But I actually think bringing the two together, the focus on impact and then to some extent metrics is really important, but so is that trusting relationship. So if we can synthesize the strategic philanthropy of the earlier part of this century with the more trusting relationships, maybe there'll be something that will come out of that will really improve funding practice. I also think philanthropy can be much bolder in the causes it supports, backing social movements and democratic reform. I don't see as much philanthropy as I think there might be on causes around democratic reform, whether it's votes for 16-year-olds. Remember, young people are the people most adversely affected, you could argue, from Brexit, from COVID, and ultimately from climate change. So why not see some bold philanthropy trying to enfranchise the voices of young people in the constitutional sense? And other areas where I think philanthropy can be bolder is on climate philanthropy. The European Foundation Centre and others, there's various climate commitments that are being launched, but just looking at the figures at the European Foundation Centre, less than 10% of its members so far have signed the philanthropy commitments around climate change. And I think we need to see much more commitment to addressing climate and raising the bar of ambition around it. Only 2% of funding, or less than 2%, goes to address climate issues. So I think there's great room for improvement there. And then, as I was mentioning before, I think where foundations invest their assets is really important, particularly when tackling climate change. There's a question mark about whether you can be doing that legitimately if you're also investing in assets and around fossil fuels and other sectors related to that. But there are different views on that point. I think we need more transparency. And then my final point, if I may, just Fran, which is about tax and the context of wealth philanthropy. Sometimes the calls around the wealth tax have been set against the call for more philanthropy, as if you believe in one or the other. There's sometimes a binary choice between more philanthropy or more tax. But I actually think we need to both give more, spend better, but also have a conversation about the right levels of tax. So in the US, there's the group called the Patriotic Millionaires, groups of very wealthy people who are saying things, and I quote, like, the unfortunate truth right now is that revenue raised from millionaires, billionaires and corporations should make a significantly larger proportion of tax receipts than they currently do. So if there are progressive millionaires that are emerging in the US, and President Biden is also, I think, calling for a wealth tax, I wonder whether there's a question about wealthy people in this country also stepping up to make those same calls. And again, the logic might be that if lawmakers only listen or primarily listen to people with power and money, then if those people with power and money are making these calls, then it would go a long way to advance a common good. So I would say alongside climate, wealth inequality is a big issue facing philanthropy, but there are things that philanthropy can do to address the challenges of the day. So my vision for philanthropy in 2030 would be, more, spending better, and thinking about the wider political economy in which philanthropy operates. Thank you all of you.
Thank you, Charles, and thanks to all the speakers. We're getting some questions through from the audience, so I'm going to build that into our discussion as a panel. One of the questions that intrigues me is an attendee who said, has Mackenzie Scott's giving shown that philanthropy is a lot easier than we all pretend? And I think that's a fantastic question. I'd like perhaps to come to Charles and then Sonal. And and one sense is to say, giving away money is actually very easy. You know, this is not technically difficult. Do we make it sound much more complex? Do we say it's a science? On the other hand, we can say giving away well may be a much more complex issue. And we may feel that Mackenzie Scott has done that brilliantly, and that we'll look back on it as a kind of major change in what good philanthropy looks like. But how are we going to judge that? How are we going to measure that? And does it come through our own biases because we like the organisations she's given to? Charles and then Sonal, what's your reflection on that?
Thank you. I mean, there's no doubt that what Mackenzie Scott's doing is really revolutionising debate about giving and really challenging orthodoxies. I'd just like to draw briefly on my experience at the Pairs Foundation to answer this question. I think at Pairs, when I directed the foundation, and certainly since, there's a real focus on that relationship-based giving and values-oriented giving. And I think that makes it easier to then invest more substantially over a longer period of time in the organizations you support and trust. But while it seems straightforward to do that, to get to that point where you actually think that the greatest impact can be about building and supporting and trusting the people you work with, it's actually quite conceptually difficult and does raise questions about how you think about impact and how you think about your own agency in relation to the influence and the change you want to see. And it also raises questions about the kind of competence of the organizations you'll support. And one of the criticisms of Mackenzie Scott's giving, there's not that much detail, partly because I think she gives for a donor advised fund and not a foundation. There's not that much detail in how she's made the choices she's made. And from a progressive point of view, one might appreciate the choices, philanthropy infrastructure, human rights, women's rights, people of color. But actually from a process point of view, she relies on a group of expert advisors at the BritishLand group and others, and there's not much offered so far in the way of understanding the rigor that's behind and underpinning those processes. So you can't argue that the giving is particularly transparent, but it's no doubt it's revolutionary and very interesting challenge to our peers. And I only hope that we'll have a kind of Mackenzie Scott for the infrastructure outside of the US that's got that level of resource and vision, but with it, a bit more transparency.
So I'd like to ask the same question to you, but also you talked about moving towards giving 10 years of funding, which is a model I'd love to see and is very exciting. What are the barriers and opportunities to getting to that shift where more funders do that? Do you think that's the kind of longer term backing and trust in grantees that Mackenzie's working on? Or is there a sort of big bang, give big, give now? What are your thoughts on that?
So to answer the second bit first, I feel like it is about relationships and it's about getting involved in the problem, because we used to always give for 3 to 5 years, because we'd look at experts and we'd read Alliance magazine and other things, and they'd say give for 3 to 5 years. But then we knew that's what we did. And then after 3 to 5 years, we said, oh, but they're still in exactly the same place or worse than they were when we started funding them. Therefore, we should carry on funding. Only because we were engaged with the organisation, we knew the challenges that they were facing, and we had that open dialogue. So I think that's the barrier. But in a lot of the discussions that have been happening, the one theme that I think is really important is that often philanthropists, we're the own barrier in good giving, because we don't want to look at ourselves and think about the biases that we have, because that takes work and it's quite uncomfortable, and it requires a lot of internal examination about our own prejudices, our own upbringing, and the way that we look at the world. And I don't know anything much more about Mackenzie Scott than the next person, but I wonder if because she didn't grow up with that wealth, because she got it through her marriage, whether she was less attached to it. And the next generation are forming all sorts of groups, one of which I joined recently, which was part of Resource Justice, which looked a lot about wealth. And the first session was on my money story. So such an uncomfortable thing to be discussing, but it made all of us realise that the way you give is so much based on the way you look at the world. And if you've been educated in a certain way, then you probably value that kind of education, and you don't value, say, lived experience as much as perhaps you should. So my sort of challenge is that we need to look at ourselves, because we have way too much agency in what we give and the way we give. And just touching on Charles' point, because I know we're limited on time, what if instead of having a mandatory, we're going to force everyone to give, what if they wanted to give? What if they themselves said, you know what, I don't need all these billions, I don't even need millions, because I can still do all the things I want to do, and it's only the excess of my wealth that I put into my foundation. So that's something I think would be really interesting to work on with philanthropists. Let's look at what's stopping you from giving. Let's not hit you over the head with a hammer and be like, you've got to give up your wealth. Give it willingly. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Thanks, Sonal. And I think that's a great question that's been touched on, of how much do we focus on getting philanthropists and funds to give more, and how much do we critique philanthropists who haven't stepped up, perhaps who haven't given more during times of crisis, and how much are we concentrated on those who could give but currently aren't, who aren't giving much at all and may not also be paying tax. The big name philanthropists capture a lot of the press attention, but actually only a tiny proportion of those with the ability to give. But I like this point about, are we giving well? Can we give better? So I'd like to come to Anna and Harvey to say, what are your hopes, both the impact measurement, and what would you like that to look like in 2030? And Anna, in your place-based strategy, how do you think about impact there? Is that something you measure specifically? And while we look at impact, can we also cut back on bad practice, ways of giving or foundation behavior that we just know is old-fashioned or ineffective or doesn't trust organizations? Harvey, could I come to you first on that question of what would we like impact measurement to look like in 2030? And what direction do you like to see us traveling?
Yes, I think there's a lot of work that's being done by a variety of different actors, including, should I say, NPC, in the area of impact measurement and impact management. The environmental area, I think, is much more advanced than is the social arena. But I think there is a fair amount of momentum building to address a series of commonly accepted and understood frameworks that would enable us to at least talk in the same language about impact, which in turn leads to the ability to have some sort of common capture of data and reporting. I think that the big debate is whether, from a business perspective, those standards should be mandated by government, corporate law, or whether they should be, comply or explain, a softer approach. And clearly the direction of travel with respect to environmental challenges and climate change is it's going to be mandated. And my own view is that we will probably see the same thing happen with respect to the social space and social impact. Now, what does that all mean from the point of view of philanthropists funding charities? I think some of the rigor that turns people off, and I know it does, is unfortunately going to be more and more necessary in order to support the kind of flows of funding that are going to be required in many of these areas. And so I would hope that by 2030, we have a standard language, sort of an agreed framework, and a sort of a reporting mechanism that can be widely adopted across both the charitable sector and the business world.
And Anna, coming to you with a similar question.
Well, Harvey, you responded very well. Thank you. I really do agree with everything you were saying there. We looked at, I looked initially at things like social value reporting in areas such as that. Gosh, I think I started looking around 5-6 years ago. There's a lot of work going on in this sector right now. And yes, the environmental side is significantly more advanced. I always say that, you can put things like net zero into Google and come up with something like that. And on the social side, it's really challenging to do that. It's because on the environmental side, I think of it as it's like an outcome-driven metrics, actually. And it's much harder to quantify that on the social side. But it is possible. So there's a lot of work currently underway. I do think it will be in place within, I don't think it's going to be as long as 10 years. I think we'll see that a lot sooner, particularly because we're seeing a lot more interest from investors. So it's not just key stakeholders, it's from investors. So I think that's quite a clear indication that something will come forward, much more concrete in this space. And I think it's very clear on the environmental side, some of the challenges by not having it mandated, that I think that's why that will act as a catalyst on the social side as well. So I agree. I think we do need to have a standard that we can all work to. And it's something that I do think that will make it more challenging for how we give grants and how we invest. But I also go back to something that many of you were talking about beforehand, which is I think something that we as business have to be a lot braver in, is how we undertake decisions and how we can devolve a lot of our decision making and involving those people who are benefiting from those decisions to that. So I think that has to go hand in hand with that sort of impact measurement. So when we're looking at that, so we do have far more integrated relationships with our communities, with the people who are benefiting from our money. And so what we're doing now, Fran, so at BritishLand, so we are looking. So we've got a series of KPIs. They're all up on our website. So we set KPIs specifically, and we're in the early stages of looking at place-based. So we look at things like things like needs-based education and employment programs, the number of people sort of into work, supported into work. So we have a series of those that we look at. We also really think about where we can make the biggest impact, and that's through being a real estate company, our spaces. So it's the use of our spaces. So that's how we're beginning to look at all this. But at the same time, we're looking very closely at social value reporting and looking at, is there a matrix that suits our model now? Because there's so much movement in this space. I think one of the concerns that businesses have is if you sign up to something and there is so much out there, will that then be fit for purpose in a few years' time if we invest a lot of money into a system and then it changes in a few years and it doesn't quite fit? Do you then have to start again? So there's a lot of, when speaking to peers and speaking to other industries, and we're all having a lot of conversations around this. It's a common theme right now. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear. These are the questions we're asking ourselves and each other. What are you doing? Is that something that can be translated? Do you think it will shift a lot? So yes, it's very pertinent that there will be movement in it. Yeah, I can't wait to see where it goes as well.
Thanks, Anna. We're running close to the end of the session, and which is a shame because I want to talk for another hour at least about all these issues. I would encourage any of the panelists, if you've got burning ideas that you can't bear to hold back, do type them in the chat so that all the attendees can see them. But I'm going to come as a sort of lightning round. What I'd like to ask all the panelists are, if the next generation of philanthropists and charity leaders are sitting at NPC Ignites in 2030, reflecting on philanthropy's contribution to social change, but also on the journey to net zero, what do you think they will say of this decade? What do you hope they might be saying about the changes that have been made between 2021 and 2030? It might be one change that you hope has been made. It might be a direction of travel. For me, I would throw in left field thoughts like we've shifted to measuring the impact of donors for charities. What if our grantees measure us on our impact? How do we look at measuring the impact of funding really complex mechanisms of change? How do we measure funding advocacy campaigns? How do we measure funding growing a social movement? Is it not that we've got a kind of measurement charity industrial complex, but more that hasn't caught up with the complexity of funding mechanisms? How can we know if we're helping and not causing harm if we throw away measurement and concentrate only on relationship-based funding? So like each of you, going to do back to Sonal, then Anna, then Harvey, and then Charles. Just wrapping up in one sentence, what do you want the change to have been when we look back at this the decade we're about to have?
Perhaps that we saw more connection with one another. We saw the humanity within the Afghanistani refugees or the women that have faced Sarah Everard and co. We saw them, we saw ourselves in them, and that would fundamentally transform the way we give and operate our lives generally. Not just, this isn't about, someone had a point, I know you said one sentence, about the super rich. This isn't about the super rich. This is about all the decisions we make all day, every day, and the money that we give away.
Thanks, Sonal. Anna.
I'd sum it up as collaboration. I mean real collaboration between private, public, third sector, all of them. It's a really challenging time. There's less resources available, and the only way we're going to really be able to move forward in this is if we all work together. So that's what I'd focus on: collaboration.
Thank you, Anna. Harvey.
And my word was going to be partnership. Look back and see that the crystallization of the kind of challenges that we all see out there really forced a much higher degree of partnership across the piece, between business, between the sector, between those and government.
And Charles.
Yeah, thanks. Just building on my earlier comments, I think the renewal of that social contract, welfare and society, the rest of us. I agree with it's not just about the super rich. I do think there's some big questions for them at a time of growing wealth and equality. There are going to be ways that inequality can be improved.
Sorry, Charles, we've lost audio.
Paying more tax.
A little bit.
Right.
I couldn't hear your last words. If you could just repeat the last key idea.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, just spending more, giving better, but also being willing to pay more tax. Part of the contribution to society. I think there's some big questions.
Thank you. And my chair's prerogative, I'm going to throw in my idea, which is too much of the debate is happening without data and without information. So I want us to look back at this decade as one where we had far greater transparency and accountability. We could see in detail what's being given, how it's being given, what it achieved, so that all of these questions have a much more informed debate, and we're not trying to guess who's actually giving to what and what happened. I'm heartbroken to draw this to a close because I feel there's so much more we could say, but I want to have a huge thanks to the speakers. Alliance Magazine, thank you for having a 20% off offer using the code NPC20. NPC itself is a charity that relies on the generosity of donors to help us provide debates like this and support for the sector. We're really grateful to all of those who support us. In particular, thanks to Barrow Cadbury for supporting our bursary scheme for the conference. We now have a short break. Please head over to Remo for our networking platform so that we can continue this discussion, or take the opportunity to grab a cup of tea or coffee before our next session at 4 p.m, which is the question time session. Do remember to submit questions in advance for our panel on Twitter if you'd like. #NPC Ignites, and we'll see you back here on Zoom at 4 p.m. Thank you so much to all the speakers and to the great questions from the audience. Thank you.